and we're doing a mini course, okay, a short one, where specifically for this one we're going to be looking at Hare Krishna, okay, the religious movement of Hare Krishna. Part of our reasoning for going in this direction, obviously we did a full, or let's say more comprehensive apologetics course on the Restorationist cults and groups, going through Mormonism, JW, so on and so forth. This is completely shifting direction, right, into its own standalone thing on Hare Krishna, the Hindu religious movement or cult, for the purpose of the fact that we, as we explained in a meeting previously, the Hare Krishnas, ISKCON, through their organisation, are attempting to establish a branch here in Katoomba, in our local town. Had their first big rah-rah drum circle up and down Katoomba Street a couple of weeks ago. And by virtue of the deeply zealous and evangelistic nature of Hare Krishna as a religious movement, if they are going to attempt to try and evangelize here in our town, then it would be good, useful, and indeed pertinent for us to understand it, learn about it, at least in the generalized sense, as well as particularly, of course, from a Christian perspective, how to engage in apologetics against it, as well as evangelizing not only to the adherents and devotees of Hare Krishna, but anyone who might be influenced or manipulated or swayed into joining them. Okay, in the most basic sense, it will be helpful for you, regardless of how much or how little interaction you end up having with any of them, for knowing much of what goes into New Age mysticism in general. Many of the new religious movements coming out of the late 20th century, of course, into this century, much of the localized fascination here in our part of the world, the Blue Mountains, with Eastern mysticism and esotericism in general, Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, Eastern concepts of Dharma and karmic cycles and reincarnation and various other such things, practices like yoga, so on and so forth. All of those things, Buddhism, etc., that are more of a flavour here among the local populace in general in our area. So many different levels will give you a good amount of information that can probably have a fair bit of interaction and kind of cross-pollination into all kinds of different areas, be it Hare Krishna specifically, Buddhism or New Age, or even on the other end of things, New Age mysticism in general, kind of more traditional Hinduism, if you happen to know any traditional Hindus, not many up here, but there would be some, obviously, all these kinds of things, okay? Today's endeavour is merely to provide an introduction to Hare Krishna specifically, give us a general overview, okay, of what on earth it even is, wherein I'm presuming that you know nothing about it, okay? Not as an insult to anyone's intelligence, just as a good starting point so that we cover everything from that point onward, right? So it's merely going to be about information and understanding here today. Other coming lessons in a fortnight's time and beyond will be more the direct evangelistic and apologetic tools. Does that make sense? Where here's the specific things to focus on, here's why this is the case, here's how you can explain this, here's how you can defend that, whatever it is, right? Those kinds of things, the more hands-on tools. This is the backdrop that you kind of need as a minimum, it is a minimum, that's all it is, to then understand why and what in those contexts to do, okay? So covering things like what Hare Krishna / ISKCON is as an actual movement. Okay, I'm just giving you an overview of what we're doing today and through this apologetics course on Hare Krishna. I'll explain what ISKCON means in a moment. How it actually fits in with Hinduism or with Vaishnavism in general. How its historical development from India to the West occurred. Okay, of course it's born in India, this movement. Its key figures, particularly Chaitanya, as well as Prabhupada, right, by their shortened names. You don't need to remember the lengthy subcontinental names there. We'll make that simpler as we go through. As well as its central doctrines, right, concerning Krishna, okay, obviously in the name Hare Krishna, subjects and theological aspects around the soul, around karma, reincarnation, bhakti yoga, which is their specific form of yoga, liberation of the soul, all these kinds of concepts, as well as others in many different respects, okay? namely its practices as well. So things like chanting, which is probably what you're usually familiar with the infinite repetition of that Hare Krishna song that they have, their worship, their necessity for vegetarianism, their offerings, their kind of scripture studies, which are really important to them, moral disciplines, festivals, and other such things, missionary outreach, which is, of course, more of where the rubber hits the road for us, along with all these kinds of things regarding organisational structure, its global presence, what it's actually doing here in Australia. That's more pertinent to us, obviously, coming up here and establishing a base in the mountains, and these kinds of things. Its public perceptions, any kind of controversies surrounding it. These are the things we're going to be able to talk about today in our lessons that will give us a more comprehensive picture of things, okay? So, where we need to begin is actually at the most basic and elementary level of Hinduism, okay? Fundamentally understand that that Hare Krishna is a religious movement. I'm trying to use a neutral term. Many outside of it, as well as even former devotees, have described it as a cult. That's not necessarily an inaccurate term for it, but either way, as a religious movement within Hinduism, that's the way of understanding it, okay? It's not necessarily or even fundamentally its own kind of standalone religion, like Islam is, for example, say, or as we are, right, as Christians. It is a movement within this, okay? It's actually a movement within a specific, probably what in English we would call denomination, right? Hindu denominations are different than ours in terms of how they're structured and what they actually are by nature. But either way, to try and give you common terms you're used to, the different denominations of Hinduism, which are devoted to particular deities as supreme deities or supreme personalities of those deities, it falls within that, right? What I'm most fundamentally referring to is what is called the Trimurti, okay? Hinduism ultimately revolves around its own triple deity, okay? Paganism in general, many of the pagan religions, not all, but many of the pagan religions have what we call in theological terms triple deities, okay? 3 different deities or 3 different personalities of a deity, which is the kind of demonic, satanic mirroring of the Trinity, okay? It should hopefully be obvious to see why that's the case, right? There are various different ways in which this kind of thing plays out and occurs. We'd be here obviously all day going through the various different examples. Usually they're often in the feminine actually more times than not. So like for example the Morrigan in Irish paganism, right? Ancient Irish mythology, the three sisters, okay? Even the ones that we know here, our 3 sisters, that legend of 3 mythological divine sisters is that same pagan concept of a triple deity, okay, that we have quite literally in our backyard, right, here in Katoomba, the 3 sisters, the rocks. Hinduism is built around the same thing, okay, the triple deity of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, the creator, the sustainer and the destroyer, okay, the beginning, the middle and the end in the cycle of life. Okay, hence their entire Eastern concept of reincarnation, right? The cyclical nature of life. Krishna is an avatar, i.e. an incarnation of Vishnu, okay? The second personality of the Trimurti, the Hindu triple deity, okay? There's obviously 1,000 layers of complexity and details to understand the greater extent of what Hinduism is, because naturally it is a complex and highly evolved pagan religion that has developed over the course of thousands of years, right? In various different ways, right? Many of which are much more modern than people would anticipate, okay? So Hinduism as it exists in our time period is a fundamentally different religion than what existed even 1,000 years ago, let alone 2,000, let alone 3,000 years ago, okay? So for example, if we were to go back 3,000 years to what is called the Vedic period, right? So ancient Hinduism. Brahma was the supreme deity above all else. It's what we often call at times the Brahmic period or the Brahmin domination, okay? Brahma worship in the Indian subcontinent, so the Ganges plain and all of the gigantic South Asian landmass south of the Himalayas, okay, all those tribal Indic peoples, Brahma worship was predominant. It had hegemony over everything else. Okay, this is a period during which many of the famous writings of Hinduism, like the Bhagavad Gita, are written. Okay. Later on, though, in the centuries leading up to the time of Christ, the Vedic period ends. The domination of Brahma worship loses its hegemony, its dominance, its supremacy, and countless of the previously minor, insignificant tribal deities arise in their significance of devotion and worship. And so then later on, mostly after Christ, which is where a lot of modern Hinduism comes from, Vishnu becomes a central figure of Hindu devotion. Okay? In fact, almost all of Vishnu's devotional worship is a advent or a practice of the last 1,500 years. Okay? There is any form of Vishnu worship or devotion, including via Krishna, is a medieval invention by and large. Not an invention in terms of origin, but in terms of development, I should say. Okay, and Krishna even more recently than that. Krishna devotion specifically is largely an advent of the last 800 years. Okay, that is the simple essence of what we're talking about. Krishna is specifically the 8th avatar or the 8th incarnation of Vishnu, said to have been born basically 5,000 years ago, roughly speaking, around 5,200 years. Okay, so the fundamental concept of avatars, or what we would otherwise call an incarnation, is that these respective deities have been born, lived, died, and in the Eastern karmic reincarnational understanding or view of the world and life, ascends back into the divine and then has a line of successive different incarnations. So Vishnu has been incarnated a multitude of times. Okay, for example, Rama, one of the other figures that we'll be looking at here, is the 7th incarnation, so the one prior to Krishna. Okay. We'll get onto that later on itself. Okay. Hare Krishna as a movement is specifically devoted to Krishna himself. Okay. So let's dive in to explaining some of the background as to what we're actually talking about here. This is on page 2 of your notes. Okay. Hare Krishna itself, as the modern religious movement, born in the last 500 years, imported into the West back in the 60s. Okay. Talk about that more in a minute. It belongs to Vishnuism. Okay? So when I said the term denominations earlier, quote unquote, the denominations are different than what we think of, right? Denominations in Christianity are national churches, right? Anglicanism is the Church of England. Presbyterianism is the Church of Scotland, okay? Lutheranism is the Church of the Germanic nations. So like the Church of Norway, the Church of Sweden, the Church of Denmark, so on and so forth. Roman Catholicism is the Church of Rome. You get the picture, okay? These are devotional to particular deities. That's really what in English terms, denomination is in Hinduism, okay? Hare Krishna, because Krishna is an incarnation or an avatar of Vishnu, the second personality of the triple deity in Hinduism, falls under what we broadly call Vaishnava or Vishnuism, okay? Which is one of those major branches alongside Brahmanism, Shaiva or Shivaism, okay? It's not an entirely separate religion from Hinduism. It's like a sub-branch of Hinduism, right? Does that make sense? Okay. It forms, globally at least speaking, a particular element of that branch, which again in those denominational terms we would call Gaudiya Vishnuism, which just speaks specifically to where it comes from. It comes from the Gauda region, which is in Bengal, okay? Eastern India / Bangladesh these days, okay? It's all regional, it's all located in specific portions. That's how Hinduism works. It's tribal deities that have then arisen in their popularity and are still deeply tribal to these days, of course, these days working through things like the caste system, which you might be aware of in Hindu culture, okay? Obviously, naturally, as I explained earlier, it centers around the devotion to Vishnu and his particular avatars like Krishna, okay? So it's not it's worshipping obviously Vishnu in a general sense, but Krishna in a specific sense, hence its name. Right? Above all, the actual specific movement. Next slide for me, thank you. Above all, the specifics of Hare Krishna, above all things, ultimately, is associated with its kind of founding guru in terms of this particular devotion as a movement to Krishna. Okay, a man who we just simply called Chaitanya by his first name. Okay, Chaitanya, Chaitanya. Yeah? Date and birth there, right? 1486 to 1534. Right. So 500 years ago, basically during the life of Martin, he was a contemporary of Martin Luther, essentially, right, in the Christian side of things, all the way on the other side of the world in the subcontinent, this man was, as a guru, teaching a new form of Vishnu worship, right, Vishnu worship, okay? Specifically, this particular kind of devotion to Krishna. So, already an important point to understand is that, kind of what I was alluding to earlier, as is the case with the vast majority of Hinduism in general, a lot of these things are nowhere near as ancient as they might otherwise appear to be on the surface. Okay? Vishnu devotion in general is not a super ancient thing, although its seeds do go back to that period. Its predominance of genuine kind of mass devotion is actually an Advent AD, not BC. Okay? Especially if you're talking about things like Hare Krishna, it is a devotion that only goes back 500 years. Christianity is literally orders of magnitude older than Hare Krishna. Okay? If we were living 500 years ago, it would be called a New Age religion, literally, okay, in those times. Right? But either way, Chaitanya is the kind of central figure of and founder of Gaudiya Vishnuism as a denomination, quote unquote, within Hinduism, right, by virtue of that. Any devotees of either Gaudiya Vishnuism or Hare Krishna as a subset of that, they don't merely regard him as kind of just a saintly guru type figure. They actually have a much higher view of him than that. They believe that Chaitanya is, or in this case I should say was an actual divine manifestation of Krishna himself. Okay? So in other words, they view Chaitanya as an avatar of Krishna. Okay? So as Krishna is held to have been an ancient incarnation of Vishnu, Chaitanya is held to be a more, quote-unquote, modern incarnation of Krishna. Right? A divine manifestation is usually more of the appropriate terms. I'm kind of trying to blend terms that we in the Western mind will understand, right? Including devotion to Radha. We'll talk about that more later on. His movement ultimately was the spread of the ecstatic devotion, this kind of zealous devotion, as I said earlier, to Krishna through particular things which were fairly common in Hinduism anyway, right? But like things like chanting and singing and dancing and kind of this super intense emotional ecstaticism, which has its various different replications in Hinduism, but this was a new particular kind of it with specific chants and specific devotions and specific prayers and those kinds of things of that nature, right? Ultimately, his key contribution was the creation and, creation's a hard word, I should say popularization, that's a bit more of an accurate term, the popularization of Sankirtana, okay, or we just often simply call Kirtan, okay. Kirtan, in simple term, is congregational chanting or singing, okay. So that's where the famous song, if you have any familiarity with Hare Krishna, is this Hare Krishna song that they all sing. That's this congregational singing or chanting, okay. That's what a Kirtan is. A Kirtan is Hare Krishnas getting together and chanting, among other things, right? And specifically, it's chanting their God's name. So Hare Krishna, Rama, those three words that is repeated over and over again 108 times, that's the actual aspect of chanting the divine God's name. Okay, that's what a kirtan fundamentally is, right? And so ISKCON, which is an organisation which I'm about to explain to you more specifically, which is the modern kind of international organisation of Hare Krishna, essentially, it fundamentally views itself as a continuation of the original Hare Krishna movement founded within Hinduism 500 years ago, okay? And particularly of that kind of Kirtana or Sankirtana movement established by Chaitanya 500 years ago, right? In fact, ISKCON's own history page on its website actually states or explains that Chaitanya established congregational singing of Krishna's names, or really Vishnu's names in this case, as the easiest and most important spiritual practice for coming out of what Hinduism believes or calls the present age, which is called Kali Yuga. I'm not going to explain at all what that means today, but I will be explaining that in one of the other lessons, because it's really, really important for evangelizing Hindus in general, let alone Hare Krishnas specifically, okay? So I'll wait till we get to those lessons to explain what that means and why that's important, okay? But long story short, Yuga just means in Hindi an age, okay? So Kali Yuga, the age of Kali. Kali is a goddess of destruction. She is the mother goddess and the divine mother in Hinduism, okay? The present age is where she predominates. It's an age of calamity and evil and sin. Pretty fitting. We'll explain more about that in other lessons, okay? But the thing we refer to, which was ISKCON, okay? ISKCON is an acronym, okay? It's the modern organisation, the modern global international organisation. That's what ISKCON is, of Hare Krishna, right? It's an acronym that stands for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISK-CON, in essence, okay? International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Ultimately, the kind of name of Krishna consciousness is, you've probably heard that kind of, especially if you're talking about New Age religions, right? Christ consciousness, you've probably heard that before, yeah. So that's all Eastern mystic, esoteric kind of language or verbiage surrounding a devoted figure, okay? So when you hear terms like Christ consciousness, that is just Eastern New Age heretical gobbledygook, stealing Jesus Christ and then treating him like any other Hindu guru, okay? Long story short, ISKCON was actually founded back in the 60s in New York City, first and foremost, okay, back in 1966 specifically, July of 1966. So actually, basically, literally 60 years ago, okay? So in fact, the 60th anniversary would be in a couple of weeks. The 13th of July, 1966 is when it was founded, okay? And so maybe the reason behind, I don't know, but maybe the reason why they're trying to now establish a branch up here in honour of that anniversary, I have no idea. But either way, it was established in New York City, over in the States obviously, in New York, by an Indian guru at the time back in the 60s named Prabhupada, okay? Prabhupada. It's much easier to pronounce when you just ignore the other 17 names that usually come with Indian names, right? But who I'm just simply referring to as, and by popularly known as Prabhupada. Okay? He was an Indian guru who himself was already this devotee of Hare Krishna as a movement. Obviously, he worshipped Vishnu as the supreme deity, Krishna and specifically, of course, as the incarnation of the avatar of the eighth. And he was the man responsible for exporting that from India, which of course is where it had been contained for 500 years, or nearly thereabouts, to the West for the first time. Okay? So fundamentally, just so you understand, it is an export of India to the Western world, of course, as any Eastern religion by definition obviously is. Right? He was that key figure who exported it from India to the Western world. And the way he did it, which probably should not be surprising, is via the kind of, what used to be called Bohemianism back in the 19th century, what we call hippies, right? The hippie movement, the kind of countercultural movement of boomers back in the day, in the 60s, of some of them, obviously, so places like New York, California, these kinds of places, even London as well. Think Hollywood, hippies, think the Beatles, think everything else in between like that, right? The underground scene in places like Harlem in New York and so on and so forth. It was specifically targeted, the kind of hippie countercultural movement of the 60s, as the avenue through which Prabhupada would export it from India to the West, okay? And that was not by kind of accident either, right? On your cover page, the image, wherever it is, the image I've actually used on the cover page is is a facsimile of the original poster that was created for the kind of first big public gathering, in a sense. The first small quasi-public gathering was in Washington Park, which is a famous park in New York. Most people have usually heard of Central Park in New York City. Washington Park is another famous park there. That was the first one ever held with 5 people and a stray dog. Probably literally a stray dog in New York's case. But then the first kind of big public marketed, branded, advertised event, I should say, was this event called the Mantra Rock Dance. Anyway, you can see that man there doing that funny trick that we all try to do where you pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time. I said that in jest. That's Prabhupada, okay? So that's the guru that everyone was coming to see, etc., etc. If you look at just the second line, so top line, Krishna consciousness comes west. The second line there, the figure, his name is mentioned, right? Swami, and I'm going to try the second name, that's Prabhupada. The other man, Allen Ginsberg, was the kind of marketer, for lack of a better term, almost like an agent, like a media or music agent, who specifically invited Prabhupada and coordinated with Prabhupada and invited him to come and bring this all to the West. Named Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg was a Jewish Marxist who practiced Buddhism, which is a fascinatingly ecstatic combination if you've ever heard one. And so I suppose you pick a lane, I guess, yeah. And so Ginsberg was directly the one who arbitraged and mediated the importation of Hare Krishna, one of the most influential Eastern New Age religions, to the West through the countercultural movement and the hippie movement of the 1960s, circa Cold War, circa all the things going along with that, especially in places like America, so on and so forth, right? Because Prabhupada spoke and wrote about the objectives. These are not hidden, and Ginsberg kind of co-signed that and aided and abetted all that of achieving cultural conquest over the modern Western world. Right, there was a very specific kind of cultural mandate that was coming with this. Okay, for reasons which will become more obvious by the time we get to the end of today's kind of intro information session, which is what we're engaging in here, right? But ultimately, their own material, ISKCON's own materials, that is, refers to or describes its devotees as part of kind of like what Chaitanya was to Krishna, right? One in this line of divine manifestations of Krishna going back to then, of course, Vishnu. The Hare Krishnas themselves, the practitioners, the devotees, view themselves as this line of disciples going back to Chaitanya 500 years ago. Does that make sense? So there's this specific, it's basically, like I said, if the Trimurti is, in other words, the triple deity of Hinduism, is the satanic false mirroring of the real Holy Trinity, Hinduism has as much of a concept of guru succession as we do apostolic succession in Christianity, right? So there's apostolic succession in the church of ministers going back all the way to the apostles, right? The apostles commission the bishops or the presbyters in the church, who then commission others, who then commission others, who then commission others, all the way down to the modern day, okay? So apostolic succession in Christianity is kind of mirrored by this guru succession, almost in a sense, between this. So there are successive gurus to Prabhupada that have then come in the last, since he died in the 70s at some point. I can't remember what year specifically. 74, maybe somewhere around there. Anyway, he dies in the 70s, I think 77 actually, now that I remember. 77, I believe. There's then a succession of gurus after him who are the continuation of this divine manifestation of Krishna going back to Chaitanya 500 years ago. So all of this is still deeply spiritually kind of integrated, going back to Bengal 500 years ago, right? So let's look at some of the key actual specific beliefs, right? Again, all general, all overview, all to give you just a foundation for what it is in the first place at all, okay? So, as you probably alighted upon already, the central dogma, the central doctrine that ISKCON teaches, right? I'm going to use ISKCON and Hare Krishna interchangeably because they functionally are, right? ISKCON is the modern global organisation of Hare Krishna, okay? The central doctrine of ISKCON, of Hare Krishna, is that Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead, Godhead meaning deity. In modern Christian terms, I'm trying to put this in modern English Christianese that we can kind of understand while still being accurate to what they believe. When we use the term Godhead, sometimes at the popular level, we conflate that to mean Trinity. So when we think of the Godhead or use that term, some people innocently and accidentally use that to mean almost like the three heads of God, right? The Godhead, the Trinity, which is not what that means. Godhead is describing nature. So Godhead, the actual a synonym for Godhead is deity, right, or divinity. Okay, so the Godhead of Christ, in other words, the divinity of Christ. Does that make sense? Okay. So Krishna is worshipped as the supreme personality of the divine in Hinduism, of deity, okay, of Godhead or lowercase g, God. Okay? While obviously it does recognise other divine beings, like it doesn't deny that Brahma exists in Hinduism, it doesn't deny that Shiva exists, or that Kali, or that any one of 1,000 other figures, or their avatars, so their incarnations, or even just other spiritual realities, so on and so forth, it ultimately and very dogmatically directs supreme worship to Krishna. Okay, so this is why this is important to kind of see, right? I explain this in part in the notes, but it's much more easy to just demonstrate here inside of 30 seconds. Ancient paganism has kind of two forms, right? There is the primitive and unsophisticated versus the advanced and developed, okay? And obviously that's not one or two things, it's really a spectrum, I should say, more accurately. And different peoples and cultures and their religions have always fallen, generally speaking, somewhere along those lines. Sometimes they've shifted up and down along those lines, right? If you were to go back, pick a random time period here, 4,000 years ago, okay, or 3,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, whichever you want to do, and in parts of the world where that culture is, I'm just talking purely in terms of like human metrics itself, more primitive, in other words, less culturally advanced, less technologically developed. They don't have, a gigantic, sophisticated Roman road network. They don't have the ornate palaces of ancient Han Dynasty China. They don't have the highly advanced economic system of ancient Persian Empire. Blah blah blah. You get the picture. Their religion is fundamentally simplistic, right? Doesn't mean that it doesn't have details, of course it does, but it's comparatively simplistic. There is a pantheon of gods, right, who all have different powers and are directly responsible for certain areas of nature, and anything else beyond that is really just determined by those things, okay? It didn't begin at that point. It began at the point of a much more monotheistic position, okay? So monotheism, right? Monos, one, theos, God, right? One God. Poly, many, theos, gods, polytheism, okay? All the ancient pagan religions that we stereotypically and often accurately think of as polytheistic, right, having a plurality of gods, didn't begin as that plurality. They began as something much more monotheistic originally, okay? You could pick all kinds of examples of this. Seeing as I mentioned palatial architecture in ancient Han Dynasty China, right? If you go back far enough, at least about 4,000 years, in Chinese mythology there is only one creator, okay? That then eventually evolves into 4 divine creative beings, okay? The dragon, the horse, the tortoise, and I forget the other one, right? That all have their own particular representations, okay? That's a polytheistic evolution from an original monotheism, okay? Which makes sense in light of Scripture in the Bible, because the further and further human civilizations get away from Eden and from God, the further they descend into paganism, the further, in this case ultimately historically, the further away that they get from Noah, when the whole thing comes to a bottleneck, okay, the more diversified and distant and watered down the original truth becomes. Okay? And you see this evolution in those of us who have studied the history of religion in general. Okay? It's very, very obvious. The pluralism of Greek mythology that you might be familiar with all of its pantheon of the Olympian gods, the 12 Olympians, and then the Titans before them, and so on and so forth, ultimately end up tracing their way back thousands and thousands of years ago to the worship of Zeus Pater, which just means Zeus, father. Zeus. Okay? There is this evolution that takes place. Now, following along, because here's the key. They decline and descend down into, again, false, mirrored, more monotheistic things like Marduk in Babylon, for example, that then proliferates the worship of other deities apart from Marduk, into that pluralistic polytheism, okay, that we're usually familiar with from the ancient world. Okay, that is an evolution religiously over time. However, fascinatingly, right, I'd love to probably do a lecture on this at some point. I've never had the opportunity to. When you then come into the historical period in which Christ arrives, from that point on, one of two things happens to the polytheistic pagan religions. Either one, they die, like ancient Greek polytheism, gone. Ancient Roman polytheism, gone. Ancient Germanic polytheism, gone. Okay? Anywhere where Christianity has gone, paganism has fundamentally died. The old gods are dead. Okay? Their temples are in ruins or destroyed. Their devotion and worship is but an ancient echo confined to the pages of history. Okay? Where Christianity has not yet broken into, which in large part, and en masse at least, is somewhere like, among other places, the Indian subcontinent. So think Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, right? South Asia, okay? The world of the Ganges and the Indus Valley civilization. It has been there since 2,000 years ago, right? The Apostle Thomas took Christianity there 2,000 years ago, okay? And it's been there ever since, but in a small, confined place, basically in the south. En masse, in these places where paganism still exists, Christianity has not yet conquered those lands, and so it still remains, at least in the generalized sense. There has been a fundamental change in evolution in those religions, not to a complete monotheism, but back toward monotheism. What I'm explaining is this, is that if you went back 2,000 years ago, Hinduism was way more pluralistic and polytheistic than it is now. Way more. Okay? I already mentioned earlier that if you go back far enough, 3,000 plus years, Brahma worship was the dominant religious worship of the Indian world, of the Hindu world. That's the monotheistic aspect that I'm referring to. It declines and descends further into pluralistic, much more common pagan polytheism. But since then, the various denominations, to use the modern English Western term, Brahmanism, Vishnuism, Shivaism, have all become more and more and increasingly more specific in their devotion. So someone who worships Vishnu, forget Krishna for a second, but someone who just is part of Vishnaism or Vishnaiva, right, who worships Vishnu, spends hardly any of their time focused on any of the other deities in Hinduism, by comparative or relative standards. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm not saying nothing at all, nor do they deny the existence of the others. Right? So no one who's personally devoted to Vishnu says, oh, Brahma doesn't exist. That doesn't happen. Okay? The amount of time they spend in any religious devotional service under Brahma is, at least by comparative standards, zero. Okay? Vishnu is almost the entirety of the focus. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Okay. So a monotheistic development is what has happened in these pagan religions like Hinduism. Okay? where Hinduism today is radically and fundamentally different than it was even 2,000 years ago, let alone beyond that. It bears very, very, very little resemblance to anything in the Indian subcontinent prior to Christ. Okay? That's the effect and power of what Christ has done in the spiritual world, where the world, even in its pagan religions, even the ones that are still off in the fringes, quote unquote, or haven't been yet converted to Christ, have naturally undergone a monotheatizing of their own religion. This is exactly, Hare Krishna might be the archetypal example of this in Hinduism. In fact, there's very few others that would compare to this. Okay? Devotion to Kali is probably the only other thing that would compare to the level of singular, unilateral devotion to a Hindu deity as exists in Hare Krishna. Does the last 5 minutes make sense to you? Yes? Okay, cool. Okay, that's as simple as I can explain it. All right? This what I call the monotheistic arc. Okay? So, hence why I say that, so backing up further one point, hence why in their religious language, God, quote unquote, is not this kind of impersonal or abstract force. Rather, Krishna is the very center and essence of supreme divine worship. And it's personalized, right? It's a personal reality, beautiful and relational and capable of this reciprocal love, right? They don't believe in an abstract impersonal force, okay? They're not like the Greek philosophers of the Hellenistic period or of classical Greece, okay? Where Aristotle's prime mover was an impersonal force, or the logos was an impersonal force. It's deeply personalized. So in other words, the way that we believe God to be personal, they also believe pretty much identically. Okay? Super important. Right? Thus, ISKCON often in its literature will refer to that term earlier, right, we talked about part of its name, right, Krishna consciousness, as ultimately being the restoration of the soul's awareness of and devotion and love for Lord Krishna. Okay? It's a direct one-to-one thing of becoming more lovingly devoted to Krishna and vice versa. The whole thing is just focused on Krishna. Right? Now, Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu, hence why there are various different names that are used, which are part of the chant we'll talk about later on. Okay? But all orbiting, if you want to think of it that way, orbiting around Krishna as the most famous and most important of the avatars, i.e. incarnations of Vishnu. Okay? So in general, Vaishnava traditions, which of course is what Hare Krishna is specifically, it emphasizes, obviously, deep devotion, it emphasizes worship, chanting, temple services, sacred stories, all these kinds of things I was referring to earlier in the overview, by and through what they would term or refer to as and understand as a loving surrender of the soul to the supreme God, lowercase g, Krishna. Not terribly dissimilar, in part at least, to what we do in regard to Christ. There's commonalities that hopefully you can see between those concepts. Okay? Now, an important aspect to understand about this is Radha, right, or Rama, another name for it. In fact, the word Rama that gets used in the chant is talking about a particular deity or essence of Krishna called Rama, R-A-M-A, or Radha, R-A-D-H-A. Okay? So Radha / Rama, she in this case is essential to this. Right? Radha or Rama, same thing, is the divine consort of Krishna. Okay? Like in most pagan religions, the male god will have a divine female consort, okay, a wife, quote unquote. In Hinduism, that specific conceptualization is different than in the West. In the West, in Western pagan religions like Greece or Rome or anywhere else, the divine consort is a separate, distinct deity. Okay? Right. So like what Hera is to Zeus, okay, or various other figures you could talk about. Okay? Zeus is not Hera, and Hera is not Zeus. Hera is his queen or his consort. In Eastern pagan religions, in the Eastern philosophies, they are male and female essences, manifestations, expressions of the one deity. Because ultimately, these religions can be described as, if you're talking about something obvious like Buddhism, pantheistic, so basically the universe is God. Hinduism, it's hard to categorize Hinduism, but we sometimes refer to it by a kind of equally modern 19th century term, panentheism, which is that it's not that the universe is God, but rather that the divine operates through the universe, which is what these divinities and these avatars are. Okay. In this case, it's ultimately monotheistic as well in this weird sense because of these evolutions, right? But Rama is the divine female counterpart of Krishna. They're not necessarily two separate deities per se as we would think of them. It's almost like, I'm using really simplistic and inaccurate terms, a male side and a female side, right? It's kind of like this modern rubbish that gets thrown around lazily of like, getting in touch, guys saying, I'm getting in touch with my feminine side. It's kind of like that, right? As literally gay as that is. In this case, it's kind of that same essence, okay? So they're not a separate deity. They're a female and a male essence, manifestation. There's various different English terms which kind of capture the picture in one form or another, okay? The reason why she's important is, apart from the fact that they chant her name, as part of the termination or determination with Krishna, is that, specifically in this case, it is that female side that is the loving, devotional side of Krishna, okay? Hence why that whole concept of what they're trying to achieve, right, Krishna consciousness, is through this reciprocal love. Rama or Radha is the kind of the vehicle for that in their conceptualization, okay? The divine feminine, okay? They often will use and terminologize Radha or Rama as the kind of original spiritual power or potency, as I say, of Krishna, and as the embodiment of divine love for them, okay? So what this produces for us is some of an understanding of their religious devotion, right? So what this actually means for them, so that we can understand where they're coming from, is that Krishna is the supreme enjoyer and the object of love, okay? Radha or Rama is the supreme lover, okay? So Krishna receives the love, Rama gives the love. That's the understanding theologically. And so she's the supreme lover and the embodiment of perfect devotion. Radha is perfectly devoted and loving of Krishna. Krishna perfectly receives that devotion and love. That's the dualistic dynamic taking place there, okay? And so that the highest spiritual aspiration for these people, the adherents, that is, the devotees, is to participate in loving sacrifice to Krishna via Radha through the practice of bhakti yoga, which is basically the term that is used to describe their religious practice, okay? So yoga, people are usually familiar with yoga, right? Which is often erroneously stripped down to its bare components as doing weird poses and some stretches. Yoga fundamentally is religious, inescapably worshipful, and are ultimately actually prayers, okay? So yoga, is obviously an import to the West since the 60s, same time period, which in many contexts has been attempted to strip it of its religious aspects. You can't actually do it. You can't actually strip yoga of its religious practices or its religious concepts any more than you can strip bowing 5 times a day facing Mecca of its religious essences, right? Like if someone bows 5 times a day at morning, at dawn, midday, noon, afternoon, and dusk, facing a very specific direction toward Mecca, and someone else says, "Oh, are you a Muslim?" and you go, "No, I'm just stretching my back," that's obviously ludicrous, okay? Right. So yoga is a fundamentally religious practice. Christians cannot and have no business doing yoga at all. Okay? Bhakti yoga is their particular specific way or their devotion, the type of yoga or prayerful devotion by which they then, imitating Rama or Radha, enter into and practice and live out and come to develop this kind of full loving devotion to Krishna. Okay? What on earth do these kinds of things include? And so this is where you can understand some of their practices, right? This is the bottom of page 3 for your notes. The single biggest one, of the most obvious and certainly the most public, is the chanting of Krishna's names, okay? Which is in these 3 different forms: Hare, Krishna, Rama. That's why those are the 3 words used in the chant, okay? It's the thing they're known for, right? They're known for the song. They're known for the chant, okay? And that's actually the chief way by which they acquire and attain full Krishna consciousness and enter into full loving communion with Krishna, is just by repeating and chanting that over and 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 over, just like you're getting annoyed now, right? Over again, okay? That's how they do it. That's the prime way. And then it's accompanied by everything else. So think of the chanting, the kirtan, right, the public congregational thing. Think of the chanting of Hare Krishna as like the center point, and then everything else orbits around that, right, in a sense, okay? So general kind of Hindu meditations and things that take alongside that, obviously that's tied in deeply to the whole concept of chanting the names. The worshipping of Krishna's deity form, so his divine form, so with images and those kinds of things that people are familiar with Hinduism. Listening to the various sacred texts that pertain to this, be they writings from Chaitanya 500 years ago, obviously a big central one for modern Hare Krishna for ISKCON is Prabhupada's own personal translation of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is one of the major texts back from that Vedic period 3,000 years ago. It's not the only one, but it's the major one. He wrote a translation back in the 20th century called the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Okay, so that's a significant text for them, right? Part of the reasoning for that is because the entire concept of where Chaitanya 500 years ago gets this idea from is actually from some of these more ancient writings. Okay, I say more ancient, it's a relative term, right? But writings going back in Hindu traditions prior to his time period, where there is one famous story concerning Brahma and Krishna, okay? I'm dialing this down significantly for time. I'm missing a bombload of different pieces, right? Otherwise we'd be here doing the whole story, right? But in essence, long story short, Brahma is asked, what is the way in which the Kali Yuga will come to an end? Okay, so the Kali Yuga is that thing I referred to earlier, which is the current age that the world is in. Hindus ultimately believe in 4 ages that go on in a cycle, ergo reincarnation. The worst and the darkest of them is the Kali Yuga, the age in which Kali, the mother goddess, the divine mother, the goddess of destruction, right, who are interestingly enough not technically an evil figure, although if you saw an image of her, you'd be shocked that she isn't, rules. It's an age of darkness, it's an age of evil, of corruption, of sin, right? Which for them began basically 5,000 years ago, i.e. right around the time of the flood, which is not coincidental in terms of when you actually mirror this to the stories and the historical developments. Anyway, the whole goal of Hinduism, under which Hare Krishna falls, is to escape, ultimately, the Kali Yuga, and that mankind then enters into the next phase, the beginning technically, of the new cycle. The first cycle, the Brahmic cycle, the cycle of Brahma, the cycle of the Creator, the restoration of the world, the ending of evil, the abolition of sin, the Golden Age. That mirrors very closely with what we believe, right? We're going to talk about more of that, because that's a really direct evangelistic point in other lessons, okay? When Brahma is asked in the stories going back, 1,500 years ago or so, how will the world escape the Kali Yuga, this age of darkness and sin and struggle? Brahma then communicates to the poet by proclaiming the divine names of Krishna until the world becomes devoted and there is an end to the days of darkness and sin. Okay? So fundamentally what modern ISKCON, like what modern Hare Krishnas are believing, is that if the world is converted to the devotion and worship of Lord Krishna, through that devotion, built upon and founded on and centered around the Hare Krishna chant, going back to these writings, 1,500 plus years ago from now, then we will be able to escape the modern age, the age of Kali, the age of darkness and destruction and sin, and enter into a golden age. Either by escaping this world, okay, through reincarnation and everything else, or the cycle of the world. So there's this, again, I'm condensing this a lot for really time in terms of complexities. That's where that comes from, and that's why they have that devotion to things that have been written, okay? Beyond that, it's other things which are relatively normal kind of religious practices, right? Having this kind of communal service mentality and operation for fellow devotees. They have particular food customs, what we technically call lacto-vegetarianism, which in other words just means no meat, no eggs, and no, what else? Something else. Long story short, no animal-based products except for dairy. So you can have dairy, but it's vegetarian outside of that, essentially. Right? That ties into, that's more broadly Hindu anyway. That ties into more specific, just general Hindu practices concerning sacred animals like cows and other such things. Okay? They do have particular ethics and morals concerning disciplines in life, right? So things like prohibitions against drunkenness, against gambling, against illicit sex, although that's very flimsily defined, and things like that, okay? So there are kind of ethical moral practices that they adhere to. But ultimately the big thing, then and kind of coming full circle, is Bhakti Yoga ultimately ends up including the sharing of Krishna consciousness via the kirtan, okay? The congregational singing, the things that they did, a fortnight ago, whatever it was now, of going up and down Katoomba Street a dozen times and singing the song and banging the drums and boom, 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 right? That's what a kirtan is, congregational singing, okay? That is them sharing, i.e. evangelizing the world around them to come join them in devotion to Krishna and attaining Krishna consciousness, okay? That's those things there, that's basically the summarized list of what Bhakti Yoga includes, okay, as a particular specific devotion, right? And so what that chant is, some of you may have heard of it, some of you have not, right, is revolving around chanting these divine names, okay? Because that specific text where the kind of salvation of the world, to use modern Western Christian terms, will come about is by people proclaiming the divine names of Krishna 16 times in this way, okay? So that's where they're getting it from. They're getting it from texts going back beyond Chaitanya's time 500 years ago to things about 1,500 years ago, plus or minus, okay? Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, okay? Rama, i.e. referring to Rama, Radha, the divine feminine aspect of Krishna, and then Hari, referring to one of the other incarnations or avatars, the seventh avatar of Vishnu. Okay? So ultimately, because each of the avatars is but this line of succession of avatars of the incarnation of Vishnu, it's devotion ultimately to Krishna, right? Who himself was Vishnu, an avatar of. Okay? So by repeating this and chanting this over and over and over again, and usually when they do the chant, it'll be done 108 times. So Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, times 108. Not always, they can do it for longer, for short, it doesn't matter. There's no strict rule, it's just usually how it's done. And so that chant can be done all kinds of different ways, but that's the thing. And so what they're doing when they're chanting this over and over and over again, that element is just very straight down the middle, pretty stereotypical paganism, right? Mindless, repetitious, navel-gazing and meditation in order to clear the mind, or what they would say is the consciousness in modern English, from or of anything that distracts from devotion to Krishna, to become filled with devotion and love toward Krishna. Okay, it's a fundamentally meditative practice. When we hear the word meditation in modern parlance, we only, because of the importation of Eastern mysticism and esotericism to the West, we tend to automatically associate meditation with only those Eastern things, right? We do need to have more of a balance, right? We've used the word meditation for 2,000 years. I mean, after all, it is a word taken from Latin, right? Meditare, okay, to think, which is also the irony, because modern New Agey meditation is about doing anything but thinking. It's about actually ceasing to think and just mindlessly droning, right? An irony, not lost on me, but anyway. Meditation means to think and ponder. So Christian authors have forever and a day described meditating upon the scriptures, meditating upon God's divine nature, meditating upon the cross, especially the cross, right? Meditating on the cross, actually just thinking and pondering and coming to understand and to learn and to appreciate and to love and to be grateful and thankful for what Christ did on the cross, right? For the resurrection subsequently, like all these things. These are all meditation is a vital practice in Christianity and always has been. We shouldn't let Eastern esoteric religions and New Age rubbish kind of pervert that, right? Prayer, fundamentally and ultimately, is a meditation. Okay. When we are in church like we are on a Sunday in the liturgy, we are meditating. Okay. When you're sitting there listening to the sermon, you are meditating. You're meditating upon the Word of God. Okay. That's what you should be doing. When we are approaching the table, right, the altar for Holy Communion, we are meditating upon the crucifixion and the sacrifice of Christ. Okay. That's what it means to remember, okay? All these kinds of things, etc., etc. That's what they're doing fundamentally here. The repeating ultimately really of just 3 divine names all revolving around Krishna. Hare, sometimes spelled with an I, Hari, I-N-E, same thing. Hare, Krishna, Rama. Okay, so just repeating the divine, their God's, lowercase g, their God's divine name over and over and over again. Going back to those texts that Chaitanya 500 years ago was picking up on. Okay, so that's why they do it. That's why they do it. And obviously, one of the single biggest ways. This is why music is so powerful. I mean, music, like anything else, music is a morally neutral thing, right? Morality is a category of humanity, right? So there is nothing either morally good nor morally evil about the woodwork of the pews in which you're sitting. Okay, they're amoral, not immoral. Amoral, in other words, they're not moral categories, right? Morality is a matter of human identity and thought and behaviour and endeavours. Okay, music is the same. So music can be used to progenerate and propagate mass amounts of corruption and evil, or it can be used to perfectly and consummately worship the creator of the universe, God, okay? Or anything else in between for that matter, okay? It's a tool that can be used in those ways. So it can be used in a morally good manner or a morally bad manner, an evil manner, okay? That has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, right? In the case here for this kind of comes in 2 different ways. This is a fundamentally musical practice. It's meditative, but music has a meditative aspect, right? The reason why music moves us so much, without diving into a lecture on the philosophy of music, the reason why music has an almost incomparable power to emotionally sway and move us as human beings, to even without words, just purely by the regular ordinances of music, right? Tempo, key, meter, etc., can bring hardened people to tears without even lyrics, is because of what it is and what it does, in that music has a fundamentally meditative component to it by definition. Okay. Because of that, that's why this is their central practice. It's also not, again, by any stretch of the imagination, a coincidence that, to refer back to the first page, or I should say the title page of your notes, of any event that could have otherwise possibly been chosen, what was the event that was chosen to be the first big public marketed, advertised intro of Hare Krishna to the Western world? A musical festival, right? Okay. A hippie, LSD-infused drug orgy of a festival in 1960s hippie Los Angeles, in this case, over on the West Coast. I don't know if it was might have been Oakland, anyway, in California nonetheless, right? That's why. Okay, that is literally why. And then more importantly, Hare Krishna probably would have failed. In all genuine, this is an opinion, by the way, I have no way of proving this because it didn't. Hypothetically, or at least by inference, it's entirely possible that Hare Krishna would have just fizzled out in the 60s, if not for the fact that very famously in the late 60s, early 70s, the Beatles put out a song doing the Hare Krishna. In fact, it is the mechanism by which Hare Krishna exploded in the New Age, in popularity, exploded in the New Age movement. If the Beatles had not done that, it's entirely possible Hare Krishna just kind of comes over, doesn't really establish major roots, and then just gets swept up into irrelevancy or non-existence and just goes back to India, right? Because ultimately, Prabhupada, the Indian guru who came over, he goes back to India. After he brings some of his devotees back with him to India, leaves others in pretty much two branches, basically, in New York and California, so East Coast, West Coast of continental United States, respectively. And then from that group of particular devotees that go back with him to India, train up even further, and then they later come back to the West, or at least their successors do, right? But by that point, the Beatles had put Hare Krishna on the map through their own rendition of the song. Okay. So it chooses a musical concert as its first big public rah-rah, and then it plants its roots in popularity and public renown through the most famous band probably in the history of music doing a rendition of it. Okay. That is, apart from how obvious that is, that is done for a very particular purpose. It's a very stereotypically satanic tactic, because as much as music has been used for the most incredible, divine, godly purposes, it has also been used for the exact polar opposite of that. Right? The level of talent and capability exuded through the height of Western Christian music, which of course is classical music, or even Baroque as a movement before it. Think Bach, think Beethoven, think Handel, think Mozart, Chopin, think all of these Christian musicians, okay, is to Christianity what the nonsense and rubbish of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s was for atheism, communism, New Age, mysticism, all these kinds of things, just the general satanic apostasy of the West in those time periods. Okay, so when you understand that, you can start to see its power, but then more importantly, start to then think about how we can then combat it from there. Those kinds of things we'll deal with in those other lessons. But to conclude our time this morning for the last of these points, I've mentioned much of this already in that concept of mistakenly thinking in the Western mind that Hinduism is kind of stereotypically polytheistic, right? ISKCON very specifically has this idea of a more personalistic, monotheistic understanding. Okay, I actually say there that it's best described as a personalistic, devotional monotheism within the broader Hindu framework. Okay, the reason why that's important is because we actually don't have to worry about becoming super. If you're just talking with Hare Krishnas, you don't have to be really acquainted at all with anything to do with Brahma, anything to do with Shiva, anything to do with anything else beyond those points. You actually can just have a one-on-one shootout with Krishna, because it's pretty one-to-one, right? It is personalistic, devotional monotheism, which is what this is, which is what a lot of Hinduism has become anyway today, right? And so whilst it recognises those many divine beings and avatars that I mentioned earlier, its supreme worship is toward Krishna. Okay? Many of those same points, again, on the final slide, we've already kind of gone through already in general, that you can read through in your own time. But the basic essence of the fact is that as long as you understand that in Gaudiya Vishnuism, or in ISKCON theology in general, Krishna is not merely just an avatar of Vishnu. Okay, that would be the case if we're just talking about Vishnu devotion. They would, of course, believe, yes, Krishna is the 8th among the other, I forgot the number is, I think 27 avatars. I can't remember what the total number is off the top of my head. Avatars of Vishnu. They don't care about that, the Hare Krishnas. Right? For the Hare Krishnas, Krishna is the original supreme personality of deity, of divinity, of Godhead. And Vishnu's forms are actually understood in the opposite direction. For Hare Krishnas, I'm talking about. For Hare Krishnas, Vishnu's other forms are actually understood as extensions of Krishna. Okay? It's Krishna, and then anything else beyond that is far down the totem pole for them than Krishna. It is Krishna is God, to put it in modern parlance. That's as straight up as it gets. Okay? Hence why their own literature, their own websites, their own literature, their own published material, referring to ISKCON, right, explicitly explains, theologically speaking at least, that Krishna is the source of all the avatars, not the other way around. Vishnuism generally says that Krishna is but the 8th. For them, it's the opposite. All the other avatars are actually emanations, right, of Krishna. Krishna is the source of those avatars, and he is the highest form of the divine. Okay? So if you're ever evangelizing Hare Krishnas, it is, I'm saying this in the colloquial terms, I hope you understand what I mean, it's just Krishna versus Jesus. There's nothing really else beyond that. It would be like it would be pretty similar, not the same, but pretty similar to talking to Muslims. It's just Allah. Do you know what I mean? You're not dealing with anything else if you're talking to Muslims. It's almost like that. It's very close. Not the same, but very close. Okay? On the simplistic level. So, we're going to work through those things over other lessons. Obviously, I'm away next week, but when we come back in July, we're going to do at least definitely 2 lessons, might do a third depending on how I subdivide the last one, where you don't need to learn every single last thing there is to know about it, right? Because any kind of complexities, like in most religions, can be boiled down to a handful of simplicities, right? At the end of the day, the kind of person attracted to Hare Krishna is like anyone else attracted to any other New Age nonsense. They are lost, they have little to no sense of belonging, their family life is not strong at best, utterly broken and shattered at worst. And this is not meant to be rude, this is just a general accurate description, and I say this with love and pity. They're not successful. They're not really successful in life by any metric or means. Like, they're generally speaking, in the nicest way I can say it, losers, right, in life. They're out there looking for something, blah 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 blah. And that's not a knock, because that's the exact kind of person that's the one sheep that Jesus goes to rescue out of the 99. So that's not a knock, but it is accurately describing it, right? It would be a disservice to pretend otherwise. Okay. No high-performing, successful banker is joining Hare Krishna. Okay. And I'm not saying that they're totally fine. I'm just saying they're a different category, unlike this one. That's all I'm saying. Okay. And so they are desperately looking for meaning, because at the end of the day, the things that we're going to talk about when we get to in these coming lessons about here's the specific points to focus on, here's how you directly attack this, and this, here's why you're doing it, and here's where you're trying to lead them to, right? So the what, the how and the why, that whole apologetic evangelistic process, right, in its different contexts, is all going to be tailored toward that reality. Okay? Someone who's trying to find love, especially reciprocal love and devotion from Krishna, is someone who has no meaningful love in their life. Yeah? That's what I'm saying. Okay? That's where you can start to see this. Okay? Because it's that kind of person that then, it's that kind of person that then can fall for like really basic things like, why on earth should I believe some random who cares guru from 500 years ago in India who did nothing other than just say some stuff? What proof, what evidence do we have that this guy was telling the truth about anything? The kind of things we do have, by the way. Right, that's the kind of thing. So you can start to then work that in. Anyway, we'll cover that when we get to those lessons. Okay? Cool. Do you have any questions on this information here?
Just to clarify, so when you say Krishna is God,
Krishna.
Krishna is God, Vishnu. Isn't Vishnu above Krishna?
In normal Hinduism.
Okay, but Vishnu does not, or he or she, whatever it is.
He, yep.
He doesn't get a look, not a looking, but it's kind of like a distant look. Is that kind
So for Hare Krishnas, because Hare Krishnas, so think of it like tiers, and not the tiers, I mean like tiers, layers, okay? In normal Hinduism, if we just zoom out and go, we're looking at the big gigantic cacophony that is Hinduism, okay? Anything and everything, somehow in one form or another, eventually traces back to the Trimurti, the triple deity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, okay? There are then devotional denominations to those respective deities. So someone who's in normal Hinduism, living out over in Bombay or Mumbai or wherever the heck, has then a particular devotion to Brahma or to Vishnu or to Shiva or to whoever. Okay, that's the second tier or the second category, right? So there's the religion in general, and then there's the specific denominational devotion to one of these others. Things like Hare Krishna are falling under the denominational category of Vishnuism in general. So other Hindus would view this as just a subcategory of Vishnuism or Vaishnava, same thing. Okay? That's different than the way that the Hare Krishnas perceive themselves, though. So that's the difference I'm pointing out. For the Hare Krishnas, so in Hinduism in general, Krishna is the 8th avatar or incarnation of Vishnu back 5,200 years ago for normal Hinduism. For Hare Krishnas, it's the opposite way around. For them, in their view, the avatars of Vishnu are actually just manifestations and avatars of Krishna. So basically what they're doing, it's not literally like this, but the easiest way to think of it is it's almost like just swapping Vishnu and Krishna. So the normal Hindu thing, he's a manifestation or an avatar of Krishna. So it's cart before the horse. Think of it in cart and horse. I'm saying, just think of it like cart and horse, right? So any of the avatars in normal Hinduism, the X amount, I can't remember how many, I think it's 27 different avatars of Krishna of Vishnu, across the time period. Because all these figures these are all believed to be ancient human figures, thousands and thousands of years ago. Born, lived, died, boom, boom. You can go and look at a painting of Krishna as a toddler being pushed on a swing by his adopted parents. There's famous images of these kinds of things in Indian culture, right? That's the normal Hindu understanding. For them, right? So in other words, normal Hinduism, all those various avatars of which Hare is the 7th or of which Vishnu is the 8th, etc., they're avatars, incarnations of Vishnu. Okay, Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. For Hare Krishnas, flip them around.
Everything else is an avatar of Krishna.
Correct. All those who came before, all those who came after, are but avatars or manifestations, emanations of Krishna. Kali, totally different deity. Okay, so Kali is a different deity altogether, ultimately related to Shiva. Okay, so Kali is essentially the female eminence or the consort. hard to use the word consort because Kali kind of hangs in her own category. But I'll use inaccurate colloquial terms, consort of Shiva. So Shiva is the male god of, among other things, death and destruction, although not in a negative sense, just like the end of the life cycle, death in that sense. Kali is the divine mother figure in Hinduism. She is the divine motherly figure and goddess of destruction. Okay, not in a Hindus don't conceptualize that as negative, but she is like the female side of Shiva. So in a sense, Kali is to Shiva what Rama is to Krishna that we talked about here today. Okay, the male-female aspect. All these deities in Hinduism have this. It's not like in the Western pagan religions like Greece, we were mentioning earlier, where the male god and his consort, they're two separate deities, like what Hera is to Zeus in Greece, ancient Greece. Sorry, these are the same deity, the same divinity, I should say, but two essences or two sides, to use completely untheological terms, of the one. Okay, so Kali is not related in any way to Krishna, and Kali is utterly irrelevant to Hare Krishnas, for example. Yeah, but Kali, if you're asking what Kali is the divine feminine, the divine mother in Hinduism, and is the female counterpart to Shiva in regard to death and destruction. Yeah. Anything else you want clarified here? Keeping in mind, obviously, there's going to be things we will talk about over coming lessons. We're bridging a big gap, right? Because we're bridging a gap between two worlds which are theologically alien to each other. Okay, there's a reason why historically, as much diversity as exists within these two broad, simplistic regions of the world, the big dividing barrier has always been between the eastern parts of the world and the western parts of the world, the old world, as we'd say, right? Europe, Africa, Asia. And that divide basically traverses, well, depends who you ask, but that division basically traverses the Hindu Kush. It traverses Central Asia, right? That is the barrier, right? Persia is as far as any Western thing, quote unquote, gets. And then even then within that, if you asked any Greek, that's all Eastern nonsense anyway, right? But either way, it's a totally fundamentally different way of thinking, right? Certain Western religions have had semblances of a reincarnational concept, at least among some of the gods, like Egypt, ancient Egypt, for example, like Osiris, coming back from the dead. That's quasi-reincarnational. But the whole concept of Dharma, of the karmic cycle, of reincarnation, these are all the ways that Eastern religions developed once you basically cross the Himalayas, effectively. Either east or to the south, in the case of India. And so two fundamentally different ways of thinking, two fundamentally different aspects. There's plenty of commonality, but the way they even conceptualize God is fundamentally different. All these kinds of things. So, at the end of the day, there's a lot to bridge, but the thing that you're going to realise, especially once you get into the more nitty-gritty details and the particularities, is that because these Eastern religions, that's why I spent 5 minutes or so trying to explain to you this concept of what I call the monotheistic arc, of the original monotheistic paganism that descended into more stereotypically pluralistic, polytheistic paganism, that since Christ and his conquest over the spiritual realm and the disruption of the powers of darkness has now been, hesitant to use the word reverting, although it is kind of actually reverting, has evolved or reverted back in its orientation toward monotheistic impulses or tendencies, right? That there's actually, as a result of that, Hare Krishna is the most personalistic, monotheatized form of Hinduism that exists. Everything is just Krishna. It's Krishna, 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 Krishna. The whole box and dice. So none of these other aspects in Hinduism ultimately matter. They do matter, but they don't ultimately matter, right? So that an individual Hare Krishna's knowledge even of Brahmic traditions or of Shiva traditions, right? So Shiva would be nil to none. It's just Krishna, 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 the whole box of dice. So it's almost, that's what I said earlier in that kind of quote unquote, it's almost just a one-on-one shootout. It's almost like talking with a Muslim. It's just one deity against another. It's Krishna or Jesus. Because they are really quite exclusivist. The only way, the only path to salvation is Krishna. That's it for them. Right? So that's where we can make inroads. You'll be surprised how well we can do that, right?